in his very opening remarks, he spoke about this idea of the Great China Dream. We've heard that kind of rhetoric before, haven't we? You know, the China Dream. We've had the Made in China 2025. We know that Xi Jinping is not a great reformer. He's not that much of a fan of open markets and of more progressive, you know, dramatic reforms. So what does his kind of vision of the great victory of China look like?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think the China Dream has really played a central role in how he's defined his first term, and I think most of us thought that economic reform was going to be at the center of that, given his background in the provinces as a leader of the party and then some early statements. But we're seeing that a different policy agenda is now taking shape, and this is one, as you mentioned, which is about the revitalization and about national greatness and about national strength. And I think one way to think about it is for the first three and a half decades of China's post-Mao era, economic development stood at the center of what policy, the sort of lodestar of policy was. And we're seeing a shift now, and a real dramatic shift from economic considerations also being put on par with national security concerns.
If you take a look at there's lots of questions over whether there's going to be appetite or inclination for change, even if he does, presumably have this consolidation of power. What does the next 5 years look like? And, I guess, are you in the camp where you think that potentially he could go all the way through to 2027?
Yeah, I think we can start out with the operative assumption that no matter what happens at the end of this second term, Xi Jinping will be dominating Chinese politics for the foreseeable future, whether that's under the title of General Secretary or as previous leaders like Jiang Zemin and Deng Xiaoping had done, sort of more behind the scenes. But the idea that he's retiring in 5 years, I think, is incredibly unlikely. In terms of what we should expect over the next 5 years, I think, although I think past behavior is a really good way of understanding future behavior, and we have a fairly clear blueprint of Xi Jinping's political economy. It involves an incredibly robust, strengthened state-owned sector playing a large role in propping up growth here, and also in terms of his outward expansion plans for this China revitalization or this China Dream. It's I think putting private sector companies more in their place, indicating to them that this isn't the old days where you had free rein, and this is not just foreign companies, this is also domestic companies. We've been seeing a crackdown on some of the big high-flying private companies, Fosun, Anbang, who have recently been reined in by the party. So I think, the real operative word here is discipline. That really what the party is doing is saying it was great that we got rich for 3.5 decades, but that had real negative political knock-on effects, and now it's time to reel everything back in and reassert control. And so we just tend to think of we're moving into a sort of China Inc. 2.0, a real upgraded version that sure has markets, and they're going to play a really important part of this, but this is all within a sort of a bird-caged economy, you could say.
Tell me something, Jude. This is Rich in Hong Kong. He's already General Secretary of the Communist Party. There's not been a chairman of the Communist Party since the days of Mao Zedong. Do you expect him to perhaps add that to his long list of titles and therefore send out even a clearer message that he's the man in charge?
Yeah, with the caveat that we really have no idea what's going to happen. I mean, the analysts have a particularly bad track record on Chinese politics. But I would say taking back the title of chairman, which the party abolished in 1982, as a sign to China and the world that the days of Mao were over, it seems like that would be an unnecessarily aggressive move here by Xi Jinping. This is not an issue of Xi Jinping not having power. He has that already. And we're going to see at the end of this week, when the new leadership is unveiled, that he hasn't even strengthened control over the bureaucracy. We also know that Xi Jinping is sensitive to these criticisms or these comparisons of Xi as the new Mao. Time Magazine, The Economist both had their websites blocked here after they made those comparisons. So again, the caveat that we just don't know, but I would say I would give this about a 10% chance that he really goes for really directly linking his rule with the past of Mao Zedong and the Cultural Revolution.
Jude, will we get more concrete, I suppose, ideas of the reforms which may be in the pipeline? People talk about SOE, state-owned enterprise reforms, but what about the shape that they're going to be taking in the future? Because we've also talked about many of these state-owned enterprises actually perhaps becoming mega state-owned enterprises and, I suppose, champions of the Chinese economy in some ways.
Yeah, I think what we should do moving forward is take that word reform and really put that to the side. Or what we do internally at the conference board is we just take the word reform and we swap it for change. Meaning it's not a normative direction, a teleological idea. It's more of just that the party is going to be restructuring, rearranging, recombining things for the good of the party state. So we, I think, collectively as an analytical community and the business community are still really caught up on this word reform. When's it coming? What's it going to look like? But the party has been, I think, fairly clear in saying that their definition of reform is quite different from ours. So I would say don't hold your breath for marketizing, liberalizing reforms, but do be on the lookout for what we could say reform, R-E-F-O-R-M, that we're still likely to see more M&A in the SOE sector. We're likely to see the continuation of the party strengthening over the SOE sector. I think if there is any sort of marketization in the SOE sector, it's going to be way out at the margins in industries and SOEs that don't have core strategic importance to the party.
Yeah, Jude, I think that's an interesting point because you tend to assume reform as being, going in one direction, as you say, opening up, becoming more, internationalized, becoming, more liberalized. But I want to stay with this topic of state sector reform because this is one that we're watching. How fast do you think the capacity closures are going to happen after the Congress? And is the idea that we're going to end up with these big, multinationals and also some of these private companies like Tencent? We had that report saying that Tencent, Alibaba, potentially the state taking I guess, greater efficiency for SOEs, but more closely held by the state?
Yeah, so two issues there. I'll take them in reverse. I think one of the things we're seeing under Xi Jinping is a blurring or eradication of the distinction between public and private. Certainly as regards to sort of large Chinese companies. It's really difficult right now to say if Tencent is a truly private company. And as you mentioned, the purchase of some of these golden shares in the BATs and other companies, again, makes it much more difficult. Add to this the increase in the activity of party cells in nominally private companies, again, for the explicit purposes of sort of getting the party's foot in the door. These makes it difficult to make that clear delineation. Where it has a legal meaning in many other countries of the world, it doesn't have that here. On the capacity closures, I think we're undoubtedly likely to see Xi Jinping's risk threshold increase after the party Congress. And so one of the defining features of economic policy right now is the so-called supply-side structural reform, which at the heart of that is about stemming the bleeding in the state sector. Right? So this isn't about privatizing the sector. It's about looking for where the wounds are, bandaging them up with the hopes that they become stronger. So I think we're likely to see overcapacity cuts and closures on the center of the economic agenda, especially when we look outside today, we see that there are some adverse effects of this real inefficient, bloated state sector. I think one of the things we're still seeing, though, is that local political economy logic still applies, and that local governments are still incredibly reticent to see the shutdown of some of these SOEs because they still have growth targets on the mind.
Yeah, and we've been talking about, what it means for the private sector, right? And Tom McKenzie, our charter correspondent, and I were actually just talking yesterday, and he made this point, we've been talking about this deleveraging campaign, and we've all kind of been, I guess, a little bit sneery watching the likes of Wang Jianlin, buying up really random assets, this like exuberant buying binge by some of these private conglomerates. But you essentially have the situation where the state is telling them where they can and cannot invest. So what does that tell you about, I guess, the risks if you're a private company in China, and what does it sort of say to foreign investors?
Yeah, again, I think this is an area to watch where we're seeing the politicization of what was more purely an economic domain. I mean, we look at the sort of outbound direct investment, we're seeing that there's a sort of partial closing of the door. That if you're looking to get FX out to be investing in areas that are of strategic importance to the Chinese state, you're likely to see those green-lighted. But if you're looking to bring out the precious reserves of the state to be putting them into things that they think are non-essential or what they recently called irrational, I think we're likely to see a continuation of that containment. But this is adding to an increased uncertainty, I think, for the policy environment and especially for what the private sector looks like here moving forward. It's one of the real distinct differences over the past decade or so, and certainly since Xi Jinping came to power, that uncertainty in terms of what policy tomorrow is going to be is increasing, and especially as we're seeing power being moved up the hierarchy into the party and increasingly into these leading small groups which Xi Jinping leads, which are now driving policy. We just don't know. I think the one thing which has stayed throughout the past 4 decades is risk containment is at the core of how the party looks at the economy.
Jude, you're talking about the consolidation of power that may well be complete in large part. What do we see next? Do we see, after that consolidation of power, a little bit more, perhaps, social reform? Some have said that it's highly doubtful that Xi Jinping is a social reformer, given the lack of evidence of that thus far.
Yeah, I would just make the comment, though, that power consolidations don't reach a sort of static state. That I think, although we're really focusing on this 19th Party Congress as being sort of some sort of hinge moment in terms of Xi's power consolidation, the idea that he's sort of reached the top. If we look back at previous history of more authoritarian governments, we see that this is an ongoing process. Xi Jinping is not going to emerge next week and admit to the world, I have total control over the system and I'm not dealing with vested interests and I don't have areas in the party which are trying to push back. Those will always be there and those will continue to be there, especially if at the end of next week we don't see a clear succession lineup coming into play. I think that's really going to spook people, and we're going to be continued to look for a continuation of his power consolidation moving forward. Again, on the reform issue, no matter what area we're talking about here, everything is possible. I think the question is we have to look at, through the lens of the party, their first question that they confront when they look at reforms are, what do these mean for stability of the party and security of the system, right? And so I think what they're seeing is they're making much more of a break towards issues of poverty alleviation, which I think still connect to the old socialist legacy of working for the people. But on the same hand, we're seeing much more of a national security agenda emerging from the party. And so I think we're more likely to see a emphasis being put on overseas activity, One Belt, One Road, consolidation of control in the South China Sea, stoking up nationalism. If we're seeing real meaningful reforms in other areas, I think those are going to be, for the party's perspective, nice to have, but not must have.